Hello, my name is Alex Iles and welcome. In today's episode we're continuing to look at Roman politics and we're going to look at the early emperors of the Roman Empire. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to continue talking about the emperors of the Roman Empire. And when we think of Rome, often we will think of the Imperial period because it's often the one that's heavily focused on. You think of the emperors, you can think of people like Augustus, you can think of people like Nero, Caligula, and they're often quite big in our popular culture. There's films, there's TV shows, there's books all written about these incredibly almost addictive characters, because we're looking at people who we today would understand as totalitarian dictators. We often talk about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome that lasted from Augustus right the way through to Marcus Aurelius, where there was civil peace and prosperity. And at least that's how often the historians and people like that who are studying this period look at it, because obviously the economy was quite strong, the empire expanded, they defeated their enemies. All of those sort of things were commonplace during the Pax Romana. And so we look at them and they're almost given this sort of facade of good emperors who were looking after the people. But actually, they were still totalitarian dictators. People were put to death and executed. People were tortured. Countries were invaded. People were enslaved. And we have to not take that away when we're looking at the Romans and the imperial period. And we have to understand with Roman politics, what was an actual emperor? How did you actually get these characters who had such total control over the Roman system? So in the previous episode, I actually talked a lot about the Republic and the kings. So you saw how you went from elected kings through to the overthrowing of the kings, through to the first early republic, and how the republic developed as an institution, and how it grew and changed over time with more senators, with more representation for the people to deal with the fact that there was civil unrest, and then how it grew and expanded and became the Republican Empire. Then finally was taken away by strong men who were able to basically use the civil unrest caused by the massive amounts of inequality in the system to become dictators for life. So Sulla, Julius Caesar, and then finally after Caesar's murder leading to the civil war that resulted in Octavian, his adopted son, becoming Augustus, the first emperor. Now, when we're talking about emperors, it's really important to note that actually the word emperor wasn't actually used during the period of the Romans. They didn't actually consider the actual leader of them as emperor. And instead, they would use Imperator. And alongside that as well, they would also, Augustus styled himself as the first citizen. He was very careful not to style himself in a way that could possibly be connected back to the kings and the tyranny that was associated with the kings with the old system. So when you're looking at the tyranny, the power, the control that these guys had, Augustus had to tread a very fine line. Because even though he was in total control of the empire and had huge amounts of power, which we'll cover in a minute, he still had to be perceived as if he was a benevolent ruler who was ruling with legitimacy from the system, and not simply because he had managed to defeat and kill off all of his political opponents. Which is a very interesting one again, because when we look at the later emperors again, it's again the same legitimacy that has to be drawn through the system. And so because of that, Augustus, when he's ruling, he actually looks to the Senate and he finds his authority and his legitimacy through the power of the Senate as well. So the Senate has to look as if they are actually appointing him, and alongside that giving his powers. And so he would often rely on the Senate to basically ratify his appointment as emperor, as imperator, and as this incredibly powerful character, even though they had become nearly ceremonial. So his authority was drawn through the Senate, but in fact he was in control of them, he was totally in control, and they were more basically just a ceremonial body within the system. So that was the first step right there on the road to full total control of the empire. Now alongside this as well, he also took upon himself to create this position of, well, the Imperator, this this role which would almost be named after him later, where it's referred to as almost like the Augustus, the powerful one. And so when he created this power, what he did was he took the role of dictator and combined it with the Pontifex Maximus, and had total control over the army as well, and then rolled in a couple of other roles as well to fully create this new creation of Imperator, or Emperor as we call it today, and style himself as the first citizen and make it for life. Now let's break down how this actually works. Because first of all, the dictator role. So the dictator role we touched upon in the last session, and so the dictator role we touched upon in the last episode, and this dictator role was an emergency power. So today, in the Western world, often our leaders will have emergency powers that have to be voted on by the legislative bodies. And when the leader, so the Prime Minister or the President or whoever else, is given those emergency powers, they are for a short amount of time. And if they don't hand them back, they will often become a tyrant or a dictator in the eyes of the people or within the eyes of the ruling classes as we understand them. So the emergency powers of the dictator role worked like this. They were given total control over the Roman Republic for 6 months to deal with this crisis. So with that, Augustus is taking the total control of a dictator and then building into his role for life. And he's copying Julius Caesar. Now what's really interesting about this is to the Romans, they saw Julius Caesar as the first emperor. And we today, when we're studying this period, it will often be shown that Julius Caesar was a dictator and he had taken over the system by utilizing the weaknesses within the political system at the time and then overcoming the Roman Republic to make his dictatorship and giving himself legitimacy. Now, when we've got that in place and in our minds, to the Romans, no, he was the first emperor. They saw him as creating the sort of the role of emperor, the Imperator, and then Augustus inherited it from him. Now, there's two ways of dealing with this. One, it's actually re-strengthening the authority of the emperors. And the reason why it's strengthening the authority of the emperors is because Julius Caesar was a hero to the Roman people. They loved him. They saw him as looking out for them. So by actually saying that he was the first emperor, then all the other emperors can bathe in the reflected glory of Caesar and say, we are continuing Caesar's role. They could say, we are representing the people. We are for the people. We are the people's emperor. And we are following on from where Caesar started, fighting back against the corruption that was in the previous system. And we have made it more pure and away from tyranny. And so that therefore would embolden and strengthen the position of the emperors. And that's really interesting. But also Augustus was in a bit of a tricky position, because what he had done was he had actually defeated Mark Antony, who also had a fair claim. He was Caesar's general. He was a close friend of Caesar. And so when you've got that going on, you have maybe question marks about his rule. Is Mark Antony legal or the right ruler, or was Octavian, his adopted son, the ruler? And so because of that, by saying no, it was Caesar who was the first emperor, I'm his son, I was his adopted child, I'm taking over the empire to actually rule it on his behalf, then that was immediately strengthening and putting himself in a position of power that he could then continue from as he went forwards. The next role that he also gave himself was the role of Pontifex Maximus, and that was the chief religious official of the Roman Empire. So this is really interesting. So the imperial cult would be focused on him, but also he would be the leader of the religion to actually go and to represent Rome to the gods. So that is placing the key religious role and also the role of dictator together, as well as a lot of other roles as well. So he is now in control of the religious system, and so the imperial cult worships the divine element of the emperor. The emperor is seen as a semi-divine on this world. And while he would never be a god while he was alive, he could be deified after his death, and it would seem that the god's authority was on the emperor. So again, that legitimizes his authority and places more power upon him, so it's harder for those to fight against the emperor and to fight against his will, because he is the god's representative. Interestingly enough, you might actually recognize the title Pontifex Maximus because today it's the title used by the Pope, because later on, we'll come to this later, the role of Pontifex Maximus was seen as less important by the emperors, and eventually at the fall of the Western Empire, the Pontifex Maximus title was transferred over to the Pope, and he became the head of the Christian religious system, because obviously Christianity became the sole religion of the empire, and so the Pope was the Pontifex Maximus, using the title but not the attached pagan symbolism that came with it. So there's an interesting one for you right there. Then also, the emperor was in total control of the army. So before, the army had been in control from the Senate. So the Senate would appoint generals, they would go out and fight on Rome's behalf. And so as they were fighting on Rome's behalf, the generals were loyal to the Senate and therefore the Republic. So now, instead of the Senate being in control of the army, the emperor was. And when the emperor was, all of the pay for the army came from the emperor, all of the glory from the military campaigns, all of the legitimacy for the conflicts and all of that came from the emperor. So now, if anyone was to fight against the emperor, they're fighting against the army too. The army and the emperor are inseparable, and the army looks to the emperor for its bonuses, its rewards, the lands that the legions will get when they retire. All of those sort of things come from the empire and from the emperor himself. And so that again means that the system is now focused in on the cult of the emperor, on the power of the emperor, on the control of the emperor, and it becomes a really, really powerful and important individual within the whole Roman system. So that's a very interesting one in itself. But they have to be careful as well, because again, the emperor must never be accused of tyranny. He can't look like a king. So the emperor has legitimacy through the Senate, but it's in total control of the army. And so the army probably doesn't really care about the whole tyranny sort of thing, because now they're looking to the emperor and all of their pay comes from the emperor, not the Senate. And so they are loyal to the emperor, and that for strengthens the whole system. The system is now based upon the military, not upon the legitimacy from the Senate. And therefore that makes the emperors incredibly powerful and incredibly important within the whole system, because the empire has to rely entirely on the emperor and the military for its defense and its control, but also that legitimized violence from the state comes directly from the emperor as well. Now, the emperor didn't just have control over the army, they also had a great deal more control over the provinces, and Augustus was really clever about this. Now, what Augustus had done was previously, during the Republic, there were proconsulship provinces. Now, a proconsulship province was basically when someone had been a consul, they would then basically retire to a province and rule it as the governor. And so that meant that they could actually strip off the wealth, develop important connections for them, become incredibly wealthy through basically taxation and all of the other perks that a proconsul governor would have. And then from there, they would take that wealth and put it back into their family, creating more generational wealth. Because you have to understand, these senatorial families, some of them could trace their ancestry right the way back to the time of Romulus and Remus. So it's a lot of generational wealth, a lot of generational power, all invested into these old families. Now, obviously, that's also dangerous because these senatorial families have a great deal of influence and a great deal of power within the Roman system as well, even though that the Senate has been in some ways neutered by the emperor. So this wealth and power can still buy you armies, it can still buy you influence, it can still buy you control. So Augustus doesn't want for there to be more proconsulship provinces in the empire. He keeps the ones that had existed in the Republic, but the expanded territory that the empire got after that created imperial provinces, and the emperor had the power to appoint those governors. So when the emperor has the power to appoint those governors, Augustus is then able to select those provinces, select those ones that he wants to continue to grow, and he then creates them and puts a governor in charge. And the governor would also be the military commander of the legion in that province. So because of that, the forces under those governors would then fight on behalf of the emperor, and the governor in theory should be loyal to the emperor as well, because they have their role from imperial mandate. So again, you can see he's shoring up his power by ensuring the governors are loyal to him, the army is loyal to him, the provinces that he's creating are loyal to him. And alongside this as well, he also creates coloniae. And coloniae are cities where the people inside are citizens of the Roman Empire. So you can take an urban area and you can create it into a colony. And so you give citizenship to all of the people in that area. So places like Lyon, York, London, places like that were coloniae. And alongside this as well, one of the most famous ones would be Tarsus. So if you think of St. Paul, who is obviously famous within Christianity and in the Bible, it says, I am a Roman citizen because I am from Tarsus, Paul of Tarsus. Now the reason why he can say that is because Tarsus is a colony. And he was born there, and therefore he is a Roman citizen. So that is an incredibly important thing, because people then could call upon the right of citizenship, the rights given to them within that nation to be a Roman citizen. So that is a really interesting power thing as well, because then they would be loyal to the emperor from their citizenship gained when that place was created. Another wonderful example of this is the archaeological site of Xanten, across in what is today Germany. And Xanten was actually created into a colony by Trajan. So you have this amazing settlement that was created by Trajan, and therefore there were people there were citizens and loyal to Trajan. The other towns and cities were not coloniae, so they had special treaties with Rome, which would then mean that they would pay probably higher rates of taxes and things like that, and they wouldn't have the same rights as the rights of people within a colony. And so that made them different. And so the people in there would be freedmen, and they would have to have a bi-citizenship, or they would have to serve 25 years in the army. And so those other settlements would look towards the colony and want to be like them, want to be closer to that, because the Roman citizenship brought privileges that the freemen did not have access to. So it's a really interesting one to study that and to have a look at it and to go, right, okay, wow, the emperor was very much shored up in the political power system that meant that it was always reinforcing back to the power of the emperor, to the control and to the absolute authority that they had. Now, all of these things basically made the emperor incredibly powerful, as I've already stated, and that therefore helped to create the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And this is the concept that basically from Augustus right the way through to Marcus Aurelius, there was a period of peace in the empire. There was stability. Yes, there was occasionally small civil wars and things like that, but they were dealt with remarkably quickly, and so you would have strong centralized government under the emperor, who would then continue to expand the wealth, the power and the control of the empire during that period. And so many of the emperors during the Pax Romana are often glorified and looked at as the Principe, the leader of the empire, who was a strong central figurehead. Now, when Marcus Aurelius dies, his son Commodus becomes the next emperor. And Commodus is often looked very much down upon, because it's very clear that he wanted to be loved. It's something that many, many people feel. We have this desire within us to be liked, to be respected, to be loved. And to be honest, if his father was away fighting for most of his upbringing, and all of his other siblings had died in plagues, and basically it was just him and his sister left, you can understand why he himself struggled. Now, Commodus is normally quite famous because of his portrayal in the film Gladiator by Joaquin Phoenix. And so when you have that portrayal, he depicts him as quite wet and not necessarily physically commanding. But the actual Commodus was built like a wrestler. He was huge, he was physically strong, he depicted himself as Hercules, and he would often go into the arena and actually fight himself in the arena against other people, which then ties in a little bit with the way they portrayed him in the actual Gladiator film. But this guy was massive and strong, but wasn't very popular. And eventually his enemies got together, and he had a lover who was a slave, and his lover then proceeded to murder him in the bathhouse. And so after the murder of Commodus, you have a period of instability. And at the end of that instability, the powerful emperor Septimius Severus rises to the top and becomes the leader of the Roman Empire, the new emperor. And under Septimius Severus, we start seeing the movement of the Roman Empire more and more and more towards an authoritarian system that was focused upon the army. So I'm going to stop it there, and in the next episode I'm going to start again at Septimius Severus and his dynasty, and then focus on the crisis of the 3rd century. So if you've liked what you've heard, if you've enjoyed the episode, why not you like and subscribe now, share the video with your friends, and if you want to support me further, I do also have a Patreon and a Coffee account down in the description where you can support me further, which means that I can take time out of my normal day to create these videos, to research them, and to present this information to you as well, which is something I really enjoy. Hopefully that's come across during the episode. So I really hope you'll join us for the next episode in the series, where we'll continue to look at Roman politics and look at the Roman Empire's steady decline towards authoritarianism. Not that it wasn't already pretty authoritarian, but it gets more so. And I hope you'll join us for that in the near future. And until then though, stay safe and well, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.